My uncle laughed when he handed me the deed. "It's a rotting box of termites," he sneered, tossing me out into the freezing rain on my 18th birthday. With nowhere to go and $12 to my name, I walked into that condemned mountain cabin. Then I found the false floorboard. The rain in November doesn't just make you wet, it seeps into your bones and steals whatever warmth you have left. That was the reality I woke up to on my 18th birthday. Most kids celebrate turning 18 with a cake, a party, maybe a rusty hand-me-down car in the driveway. I celebrated it by watching my Uncle Richard toss a black garbage bag containing all my earthly possessions onto the wet pavement of his driveway. "You're a man now, Thomas," Richard had said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "The state stopped paying your stipend at midnight. We've done our part. You're on your own. My parents had passed away in a multi-car pile-up when I was 15, leaving me in the reluctant care of my father's brother. Richard and his wife didn't want a grieving teenager. They wanted the monthly foster checks. The moment the money dried up, so did their obligation. But there was one piece of unfinished business. My grandfather, Harrison Weaver, had died 2 months prior. Harrison was the family pariah, a reclusive, eccentric man who had retreated into the deep Appalachian wilderness 30 years ago and severed all ties with society. Uncle Richard hated him. Everyone in the family thought the old man had lost his mind. Before I was thrown out completely, Richard shoved a manila envelope into my chest. "From the lawyer," he grunted. "Edgar Belmont over at Belmont and Associates. Old man Harrison left you his estate. Don't get excited. I already had the county appraiser look at it. It's a condemned rotting shack sitting on a useless rocky incline in Finch County. The back taxes alone are worth more than the lumber. It's worthless. Good luck." And just like that, the heavy oak door slammed in my face. I stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, shivering in my thin denim jacket, staring at the envelope. I had exactly $12.45 in my pocket. I was homeless. I had no friends I could stay with, no job lined up and no safety net. All I had was a piece of paper declaring me the sole owner of a worthless cabin 50 miles away in the brutal, freezing mountains. Desperation makes your choices very simple. I could sleep under a bridge in the city and risk freezing to death, or I could take a bus to Finch County and sleep under a sagging roof. I chose the roof. The Greyhound bus dropped me off at a lonely gas station at the base of the mountain range, just as the sun was dipping below the tree line. The air up here was significantly colder, biting at my exposed neck and wrists. The gas station attendant, an older man with grease-stained overalls, looked at the address on the deed when I asked for directions. "You heading up to the old Weaver place?" he asked, squinting at me through thick spectacles. "Son, you don't want to go up there. Place has been empty for months, and even when Harrison was alive, it was barely standing. The roof is caving in. There's no power, no running water. The county condemned it last year." "It's all I have," I replied, my voice cracking slightly. He gave me a look of profound pity, sighed, and handed me a cheap plastic flashlight and a book of matches. "Keep to the main logging road. When you see the rusted-out Chevy, take the deer trail to the left. Watch your step. The ground is treacherous. The hike took 3 hours. It was a brutal, exhausting climb in pitch-black darkness. The flashlight beam bounced off twisted tree roots and jagged rocks. Every snap of a twig sounded like a predator in the woods. By the time I finally spotted the rusted Chevy, my legs were burning and my lungs were begging for oxygen. I followed the narrow, overgrown deer trail until the trees broke, revealing my inheritance. Uncle Richard hadn't exaggerated. The cabin was a nightmare. It was a 1-story structure made of dark, rotting wood. The porch drooped dangerously to one side like a broken jaw. Half the shingles were missing from the roof, and the windows were completely boarded up with mismatched splintered plywood. It smelled of wet earth, mildew, and decay. It looked exactly like a place where a crazy hermit would go to die. I pushed on the heavy front door. It groaned, the rusted hinges shrieking in protest, and swung open. The inside was pitch black. I clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Dust motes danced in the pale light. The interior was a chaotic mess of hoarded junk. Stacks of yellowed newspapers reached the ceiling. Broken furniture, rusted tin cans, and strange, twisted metal sculptures littered the floor. There was a rusted cast-iron wood stove in the center of the room, and a filthy mattress shoved into the corner. I was 18, entirely alone in the world, standing in a house of garbage. I sank onto a relatively clean wooden crate, put my face in my hands, and cried. I cried for my parents, I cried for my cruel uncle, and I cried for the terrifying reality of my future. But tears don't generate heat. The dropping temperature forced me to act. I used the matches the gas station attendant gave me, and some of the dry newspapers to start a small fire in the cast-iron stove. It smoked terribly, filling the room with a bitter haze, but it eventually caught. I wrapped myself in an old moth-eaten wool blanket I found draped over a chair curled up on the filthy mattress, and prayed I would survive the night. I woke up the next morning to shafts of grey, freezing light piercing through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. My body ached, my stomach was roaring with hunger, but I was alive. In the daylight, the cabin looked even worse. It was apparent that Harrison Weaver had descended into severe paranoia in his final years. The walls were covered in chaotic scribbles, mathematical equations, blueprints of strange machines, and endless repetitive phrases. They don't know the weight of the mountain. One scribbled line read, "The vultures will come, but the nest is buried." Read another. I spent the first few hours trying to make the space habitable. I dragged bags of trash out to the porch and reorganized the stacks of newspapers. It was during this miserable cleanup that I found the first clue. Inside a rusted Folgers coffee can sitting on the mantelpiece above the wood stove, I found a small leather-bound journal. The pages were crisp, contrasting sharply with the decay around it. I opened it, expecting to find the rambling thoughts of a madman. Instead, the handwriting was precise, elegant, and entirely lucid. October 14th, 2018, the first entry read, "Richard called today. He wants the land. He told me I belong in a home. My own son circling like a buzzard. He thinks I'm a fool. He thinks I spent 30 years up here doing nothing but talking to the trees. He has no idea what lies beneath the floorboards. I have secured the legacy. When the time comes, it will go to the boy. Thomas has his mother's heart. He won't sell out." I stared at my name on the page, my heart hammering against my ribs. Secured the legacy. What legacy Uncle Richard had insisted? Harrison died, penniless, burdened by massive tax debt. I read further. The journal was filled with detailed accounts of engineering, geology, and architecture. Harrison hadn't been a madman. He had been a retired structural engineer before he retreated to the woods. The chaotic scribbles on the walls weren't madness, they were camouflage. A distraction for anyone who might break in looking for valuables. November 2nd, 2021. Another entry read, "The insulation is perfect. The dimensions are hidden in plain sight. Let them measure the outside. They never measure the inside. The void is safe." I stood up slowly, the journal falling to my side. Let them measure the outside. They never measure the inside. I grabbed a long piece of twine I found in a drawer and walked out to the front porch. The wind was howling, biting at my skin. but the adrenaline rushing through my veins kept me warm. I pinned one end of the twine to the front corner of the cabin and walked the length of the exterior wall to the back corner. I tied a knot in the twine to mark the exact length. Then I went back inside. I pressed the knotted twine against the front interior wall and walked straight back toward the rear of the cabin. When I hit the back wall, I looked down at the twine in my hands. There was nearly 15 feet of extra twine left over. I blinked my mind, struggling to process the impossible geometry. I did it again. I measured the width. The outside width matched the inside width perfectly, but the length, the cabin was 40 feet long on the outside, but only 25 feet long on the inside. There was a 15-foot void at the back of the cabin, a room that didn't exist from the inside, hidden behind a false wall. I rushed to the back wall of the cabin. It looked completely normal, wood paneling covered in grime and water stains, with a large, heavy oak bookshelf bolted directly into the studs. I began tearing at the wood. I pounded my fists against the paneling. Thud, thud, thud. It was a dull, heavy sound. It wasn't hollow drywall. I grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker from the wood stove and swung it with all my might at the wood paneling right next to the bookshelf. The wood splintered, but the poker bounced off with a harsh, metallic clang. My breath hitched. I dropped the poker and peeled back the splintered wood. Underneath the cheap 1970s wood paneling wasn't a wooden stud or drywall. It was solid, reinforced steel. My grandfather hadn't just built a false wall. He had built a vault. Frantic, I turned my attention to the heavy oak bookshelf. I tried to pull it, but it wouldn't budge. I emptied the junk off the shelves, searching for a lever, a button, anything. My eyes darted around the room, back to the journal, back to the wall. The dimensions are hidden in plain sight. I looked at the bookshelf again. There was a small circular knot in the wood on the third shelf, polished smoother than the rest. I pressed it. Nothing happened. I tried to twist it. It rotated slightly, stopping with a heavy, satisfying, mechanical click. Slowly, silently, the entire massive oak bookshelf, which must have weighed hundreds of pounds, swung outward on heavy internal hinges. A rush of cold, perfectly dry, climate-controlled air washed over my face. It smelled faintly of old paper machine oil, and something else, something metallic. I raised my cheap plastic flashlight, my hands trembling so violently I could barely keep the beam steady. As the light pierced the darkness of the hidden 15-foot room, my jaw dropped. Uncle Richard said this cabin was a rotting box of termites. He said it was worthless. As I stepped over the threshold into the secret room my grandfather had spent 30 years building, I realized Uncle Richard was the biggest fool on the face of the earth. Because the room wasn't empty. It was stacked floor to ceiling, with military-grade waterproof Pelican cases walls of meticulously labeled filing cabinets, and resting in the very center, on a steel table, a stack of heavy canvas bags bearing the faded stamp of the United States Mint, and sitting right on top of the bags was an envelope with my name on it. I tore open the heavy parchment envelope with trembling, dust-covered fingers. The paper inside was thick and crisp, carrying a faint scent of cedar. It was a letter from my grandfather, Harrison Weaver, dated just 3 weeks before his death. My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, it means you survived your 18th birthday. I know Richard threw you out. I knew he would the moment the state money stopped arriving. I am sorry I could not be there to shield you from his cruelty, but I had to protect you from something far worse, his greed. The world thought I was a madman who fled to the woods to talk to the squirrels. Let them think it. In the late 1980s, before you were even a thought, I owned a prominent aerospace engineering firm in Chicago. I held the primary patents on a specific titanium alloy used in commercial jet turbines. When I sold the company, I walked away with a fortune. But I watched men like your Uncle Men obsessed with status and synthetic wealth destroy families over paper money. I refused to let my life's work become a slush fund for parasites. I liquidated everything. I bought tangible assets, pre-1933 American gold-bearer bonds and rare earth metals. Then I retreated to this mountain to build a fortress disguised as a ruin. Richard thinks this land is worthless. He is currently working a back-channel deal with a commercial developer named Arthur Pendleton. They want to bulldoze this cabin to strip mine the lithium deposits buried deep within the mountain's bedrock, but they cannot mine it without the original mineral rights deed which sits directly beneath this letter. You are no longer an orphan, Thomas. You are a king in exile. Claim your kingdom. My breath hitched in my throat as I set the letter down on the steel table. With shaking hands, I untied the thick cord on the first canvas bag from the United States Mint. The heavy fabric parted, and the dull, magnificent gleam of gold reflected against my cheap flashlight beam. The bag was filled to the brim with double eagle $20 gold coins, each one perfectly preserved. There were dozens of these bags. I moved to the military-grade Pelican cases stacked against the back wall. Snapping the heavy latches open, I found rows of vacuum-sealed packages containing thick stacks of high-denomination municipal bearer bonds untouched by inflation or banking collapses. Beside them were dense, heavy ingots of palladium and rhodium metals that I would later learn traded for exponentially more than gold on the industrial market. I was standing in a room containing tens of millions of dollars. The staggering weight of it forced me to sit heavily on the concrete floor. My entire life, the hunger, the threadbare clothes, the endless nights enduring Uncle Richard's verbal abuse had all been a temporary trial. But my relief was violently interrupted. The sound of heavy tires crushing gravel echoed through the thin, rotting exterior walls of the cabin. Headlights cut fiercely through the boarded-up windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the piles of trash in the main room. I froze. "Get the crowbar, Wyatt," a voice bellowed from outside. It was Uncle Richard. "Place is a structural hazard, Mr. Weaver." A second, deeper voice replied. "We shouldn't even be stepping foot on the porch." "I'm not waiting another day," Richard snapped. "Pendleton wants the demolition crew up here by Monday. We need to clear out the old man's junk and ensure that ungrateful brat didn't squat here. If he did, you arrest him for trespassing." Panic surged through my veins like ice water. I scrambled up from the floor. I couldn't let them find the vault. I sprinted out of the hidden room, grabbing the heavy oak bookshelf. I pulled it with all my strength. The massive door swung shut silently on its oiled hinges, clicking firmly into place. I hurriedly threw some of the yellowed newspapers and broken lamps back onto the shelves to camouflage the entrance. Just as I kicked a rusted tin can out of the way, the front door of the cabin exploded inward. Uncle Richard stepped through the splintered doorframe, flanked by Arthur Pendleton, a slick man in a tailored cashmere overcoat that looked absurd in the rugged wilderness, and a uniformed local officer, Deputy Wyatt. Richard stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing by the wood stove. His face twisted into a snarl of pure disgust. "I told you to leave the counter, you little parasite," Richard spat, stepping aggressively into the room. "What part of you're on your own? Didn't you understand?" "This is my property," I said, my voice shaking initially, but stabilizing as I remembered the multi-million-dollar fortress standing right behind me. "You handed me the deed yesterday. Remember?" Pendleton sighed, rubbing his temples in annoyance. "Richard, you said the property was clear. I'm not dealing with a squatter's rights lawsuit. Get the kid out of here." He's not a squatter, Arthur. He's just an idiot, Richard sneered. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his leather jacket and tossed it onto the filthy mattress. That's a quitclaim deed. Sign it. I'll give you $500 cash right now to go buy a bus ticket to California. If you don't, Deputy Wyatt here is going to arrest you for vagrancy and possession of stolen property. Stolen property, I scoffed. From my own house. Deputy Wyatt stepped forward, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. Son, your uncle is the executor of the estate's debts. He claims there are missing valuables. We can do this the easy way, or you can spend the weekend in a holding cell. They were trying to bully me. 24 hours ago it would have worked. I would have taken the $500 and vanished, leaving them to discover the lithium, the gold, and the vault. But Harrison Weaver had prepared me. There are no missing valuables, I said, stepping away from the bookshelf and walking directly toward Richard. And you aren't the executor of anything. The lawyer, Edgar Belmont, oversees the estate. Furthermore, you can't sell this land to Arthur Pendleton because you don't own the mineral rights. Pendleton's smug demeanor vanished instantly. He shot a furious glare at my uncle. What is he talking about, Richard? You told me the surface deed included subsurface rights. It does. Richard stammered, his face flushing deep red. He lunged forward, grabbing me by the collar of my thin denim jacket. Listen to me, you little punk. I don't know what garbage you've been reading in this madhouse, but you are going to sign that paper right now. He shoved me violently backward. I collided heavily with the oak bookshelf. The impact rattled the heavy structure. A stack of old newspapers cascaded to the floor, and my shoulder slammed directly into the polished circular knot of wood on the third shelf. Click. The heavy mechanical sound echoed through the silent, dusty cabin like a gunshot. Richard froze. Pendleton and Wyatt stared in confusion as the massive oak bookshelf slowly, almost theatrically, swung open on its own weight, revealing the pristine, steel-reinforced vault and the glaring white light within. The silence in the room was absolute. The contrast between the rotting, garbage-filled cabin and the ultra-modern, climate-controlled vault was impossible for their brains to process immediately. Then Richard saw the canvas bags on the table, the seal of the United States Mint, the glint of a spilled double-eagle coin on the steel table. My God! Pendleton whispered, his eyes wide with unadulterated greed. The crazy old bastard actually did it, Richard breathed. He dropped my collar entirely, his eyes glazed over with a sudden rabid hunger. He stepped toward the open vault, completely forgetting about me, the quitclaim deed, and the developer. He crossed the threshold into the secret room. Pendleton, not wanting to be left behind, hurried in right after him. Deputy Wyatt stood at the entrance, his jaw slack, staring at the stacks of Pelican cases. "Look at this," Richard cackled, tearing open a vacuum-sealed bag of bearer bonds. "Millions. He hid millions from me. Wyatt, get the truck backed up to the porch. We're loading this all up tonight." "I don't think so," I said quietly. I stepped up to the exterior edge of the bookshelf. On the inside of the doorframe, detailed in my grandfather's journal, was a small red emergency lockdown toggle. Richard spun around, his face twisted in a manic grin. "You think you can stop me, Thomas? I'll bury you under this cabin." "You're already buried, Richard," I replied. I slammed my palm against the red toggle and yanked the heavy oak bookshelf toward me. The mechanism engaged with a terrifying hiss of pneumatics. Richard lunged for the door, but he was too late. The massive steel-reinforced door slammed shut with a deafening boom, locking flawlessly into the steel doorframe. The sound of their screaming was instantly muted. The vault was entirely soundproof. Deputy Wyatt jumped back, his hand flying to his sidearm. "What did you just do? Open that door?" "I can't," I said calmly, looking the corrupt deputy dead in the eye. "It's on a localized structural lockdown. The interior release is disabled when the red toggle is hit. They are locked inside a federal-grade bank depository. And since my grandfather's estate contains federally registered bonds, breaking into that vault is a federal crime." Wyatt paled. He knew he was out of his depth. "You're going to use your radio, deputy," I instructed him, "and you are going to call Edgar Belmont at Belmont and Associates in the city. Then you are going to call the state police and request a federal marshal. Tell them there has been an attempted armed robbery and extortion at the Weaver estate." By dawn, the mountain was swarming with flashing red and blue lights. Edgar Belmont, a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his 60s, arrived just as the sun broke over the trees. He took one look at the situation, read the letter I handed him, and smiled. "Your grandfather was a brilliant, paranoid genius," Belmont chuckled, adjusting his spectacles. "He set this trap years ago. He knew Richard would attempt to strong-arm you. He legally classified that hidden room as a secure financial depository. By entering it with the intent to steal your uncle and Mr. Pendleton have committed a slew of state and federal felonies. It took the fire department 3 hours with hydraulic rescue tools to pry the vault door open. When they finally did, Uncle Richard and Arthur Pendleton emerged pale, shaking, and utterly defeated. The climate control had kept them perfectly safe, but the psychological torture of being trapped in a soundproof box of wealth they could never touch had broken them. State troopers placed Richard in handcuffs, immediately reading him his rights as he stared blankly at the dirt. He didn't even look at me as they shoved him into the back of a cruiser. Pendleton tried to bargain his way out, screaming about his lawyers, but the evidence of extortion was overwhelming. Deputy Wyatt was quietly stripped of his badge and detained for conspiracy. As the police cleared the scene, Edgar Belmont placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "The estate is fully yours, Thomas. The gold, the bonds, the mineral rights. All of it clear of probate, just as Harrison designed." Belmont looked at the rotting walls of the cabin. "What do you want to do with this place? Demolish it?" I looked around the room. I saw the chaotic scribbles on the walls, the false geometry, the genius hidden beneath the decay. "No," I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face for the first time in years. "I'm going to rebuild it, exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted." At 18, I walked into a rotting, condemned cabin as a homeless orphan. I walked out a multimillionaire, the sole owner of a mountain fortress, and the guardian of a legacy that proved sometimes the greatest treasures in life are the ones hidden right beneath our feet. If Thomas's incredible journey from a homeless teenager to a multimillionaire, outsmarting his greedy uncle, kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We bring you thrilling, real-life stories of hidden secrets, unbelievable drama, and ultimate justice every single week. Don't let the algorithms hide our next adventure from you. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with a friend. What would you do if you found a hidden vault? Comment below.